Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the Kevin Michael Grace Show. I think we can say with some certainty that the coronavirus nightmare, well, the first phase of it, has come to an end. How long the sanitary dictatorship will remain in place is another question. I'm going to lead today with Toby Young and his site Lockdown Skeptics with a remarkable story. The Daily Mirror leads with the preprint estimating that by the end of April, 29% of the UK population may have already had the virus. 29% of 66 million is 19 million. If we assume that roughly 50,000 people in the UK will have died from COVID-19 by May 21st, allowing for the 3-week lag time between infection and death, that gives us an infection fatality rate of 0.076%, less than half the infection fatality rate of seasonal flu. So to recap, apparently by the end of April, which was more than 2 weeks away, 29% of the UK population may have already had the coronavirus, and an infection rate of 0.076%. Is a seroprevalence of 29% high enough for herd immunity? Yes, according to a summary of the evidence by Nicholas Lewis about the threshold that needs to be reached that I flagged a few days ago. According to Lewis, the variation in COVID-19 susceptibility and infectivity between individuals, arising mainly from differences in their social connectivity, lowers the herd immunity threshold to 7%. That is 24% of the population, much lower than the 50 to 60% previously thought. His analysis draws on a recent preprint by Gomez et al. Entitled Individual Variation in Susceptibility or Exposure to SARS-CoV-2 Lowers the Herd Immunity Threshold. New data from London suggests the city has already obtained herd immunity. According to the latest estimates by Public Health England and Cambridge University, as reported in the Telegraph, only 24 people a day are being infected in the capital, and the R has fallen to 0.4. That means the number of new infections is halving every 3.5 days, and London will have virtually eliminated the virus by the end of the month. It is Yorkshire and the Northeast that have the highest infection rate, according to the PHE Cambridge analysis, double that of the capital. Turns out it's Londoners who should be worried about visitors from Yorkshire and the Northeast, not the other way around. But it's not all good news. Of course it isn't. According to the World Health Organization, that August highly respected, universally respected organization, the second wave of the pandemic will, of course, be deadlier than the first. The Telegraph has interviewed Dr. Hans Kluge, director for the WHO European region, who delivered a stark warning to countries beginning to ease their lockdowns, saying that now is the time for preparation, not celebration. File this under the same heading as the WHO's January 14th announcement that there's, quote, no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission. My lockdown skeptic of the week is Luke Johnson, former chairman of Channel 4 and Pizza Express, who was on Question Time last night. He dared to suggest the lockdown will cause a greater loss of life than it will prevent, and duly reaped the world win. One of the points that he made is that if you're under 60 with no underlying health conditions, you're more likely to drown than die of COVID-19. I was sent a terrific piece this morning by an occupational health doctor about the catastrophic consequences for the British economy of treating COVID-19 as a workplace health hazard, similar to asbestos. He rightly points out that there's no scientific evidence that workplaces are more hazardous environments than any other environments when it comes to virus susceptibility. But over time, the risk of catching the virus has morphed from a hazard that exists in the general community to a hazard that's specific to the workplace. This is a consequence, in part, of the government telling people to stay in their homes to avoid infection. But it may also be related to the widespread belief that so-called key workers are at greater risk of infection than others because they're still at work. Actual fake news and misinformation that's pumped out by the mainstream media daily. So, Young writes, I have to confess I hadn't thought through to the consequences of branding the workplace a hazardous environment, but this occupational health doctor has, and it's clearly going to be a massive problem. And yes, he has a cartoon here which shows someone, a chef, presumably unemployed, talking to the Grim Reaper and says, "Thought you'd be flat out," that's to say, exhausted. And the Grim Reaper says, "So did I. That'll teach me to trust the modeling." More depressing polling news. A recent 5-country survey found that British voters topped the table in wanting their government's top priority to be limiting the spread of the virus, 73%, rather than avoiding recession, 14%. That net 59-point lead for tackling the virus compares with net figures of 44 points in Japan, 30 in the US, 16 in Germany, and 15 in Sweden. A reader tells me of the difficulties he's had trying to see a dentist. When the dentists open possibly in July, they will think that they will only be doing teeth extractions anyway. All the dental work involving aerosols, i.e. drilling and filling, is not allowed and will not be available for months because of the need for PPE for all staff and a total refit of dental surgeries. We have returned to the world of dentistry in the 18th century. This is quite shocking, and indeed it is, and it gives you an idea of the arrogance of our leaders, that they can actually say things, which I'm going to tell you, in public. Dr. Jeanette Young, the Chief Health Officer of Queensland in Australia, has told the Brisbane Times that she urged the state's Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, to shut down schools in order to send a message, not because she thought it was scientifically advisable. Here's the quote, direct quotation. Dr. Young told Ms. Palaszczuk to shut down schools on March the 26th. She says, while evidence showed schools were not a high-risk environment for the spread of the virus, closing them down would help people understand the gravity of the situation. If you go out to the community and say, this is so bad, we can't even have schools, all schools have to be closed, you are really getting to people, Dr. Young says. So sometimes it's more than just the science and the health, it's about the messaging. Young comments, I've long suspected that senior civil servants think they know better than democratically elected politicians and have no qualms about misrepresenting scientific or legal advice in order to manipulate them. But they don't often brag about it in national newspapers, particularly not when still in post. One telling detail from the profile, Dr. Young has a no smoking sign displayed on her trophy wall, given to her by Health Minister Stephen Miles after she helped get cigarettes banned in national parks in 2017. On the subject of schools, a reader has passed on a Facebook post complaining about the arrangements that have been made at Hollywell Village First School in Whitley Bay to facilitate its reopening on June the 1st. And this applies to children between the age of 4 and 6. Children are to be isolated in bubbles of small groups. They are to remain with one teacher and one classroom all day. All toys, books, and soft furnishings will be removed. Children to work at desks 1 meter apart, all to face the same direction and not mix, including nursery. Desks to be continually cleaned throughout the day, to be seated at desks all day, no sitting on the floor. Children only to attend in clean clothes and a clean coat every day. No hot lunch for reception in year 1, packed lunches to be provided by the school, no outdoor equipment to be touched. They will have to spend much of the day working independently. The teacher cannot help them. Set toilet times and toileting accidents. Children are to clean themselves up. If they can't, then the parent has to come and collect the child to clean them at home. Young's correspondent says the psychological scars this will leave beggar belief. And I suppose, was it the Jesuits used to say? Give me a child by the age of 7 and I will, give you the man. Well, we're going to start apparently at the age of 4 years old, teaching children to be terrorized at all times. Someone has sent me an interesting piece published in The New Scientist in 2007, saying the cause of the foot and mouth epidemic was a virus escaping from a leaky pipe at a government research lab in Pirbright, Surrey. Perhaps the theory that SARS-CoV-2 escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology isn't that far-fetched after all. And he comments on a very long article with many, many illustrations by two journalists in the New York Times who are dumping all over Professor John Ioannidis, who is professor of medicine at Stanford, and misinformation, disinformation. So here we have journalists telling physicians what is true and what is false about medicine. It is really quite remarkable. Trouble is, the estimate of the death rate in that preprint, 0.17%, has turned out to be more accurate than official estimates. If you look, he has collated the data from some of the major PCR and serological studies, and the median infection fatality rate is 0.36%, admittedly more than double 0.17, but bear in mind, that was an estimate of the IFR in Santa Clara County. And an IFR of 0.36 is just over a third of the estimate used in the Imperial College model, which was 0.9%. So which figure should be classified as misinformation? The one produced by Professor Ioannidis and his team at Stanford, or the one produced by Professor Ferguson and his team at Imperial? I'm willing to bet my house that when the IFR of SARS-CoV-2 is a settled figure, it will be closer to 0.17% than 0.9%. The New York Times concludes its analysis by saying that there are two intranets, one interested in scientific evidence and governed by reason, the other a wild west dominated by right-wing conspiracy theories. That's kind of true, but the authors of the article, Alashu Bajak and Jeff Howe, have got it backwards. It's mainstream media organizations like the New York Times and the BBC that are disseminating propaganda, with the truth about coronavirus more likely to be found in little tributaries of the internet like this one. And the authors of the piece are described as teachers of journalism at Northeastern University. So, I see that in Austria, people who are fighting back against the panic there are urged to wear face masks with the word mundtot, which translates as mouth dead or silenced. This group called ICI, the Initiative for Evidence-Based Information on the Coronavirus, organized a protest in Vienna outside the Austrian Chancellery yesterday. It was forbidden by the police, but people gathered anyway. The text at the top of the page translates as, "We're not left-wing, we're not right-wing, we're angry." One thing I've noticed about ICI and Widerstand to 2020 Deutschland is that both organizations are militantly pro-free speech. Meanwhile, in Germany, the scandal caused by the leak of an 80-page impact assessment of the lockdown by an auditor in the Ministry of the Interior continues to rumble on. And yes, that governments are leaking information, or information is being leaked, which causes one to doubt the measures that they have taken. Slovenia declared an official end to its coronavirus epidemic yesterday, becoming the first country in Europe to do so. It was among the first to ease its lockdown on April 20th and saw no increase in infections. To date, it has had 1,464 cases and 103 deaths. So, here is something from Off Guardian on the point that I just made. From the beginning of the crisis, we've been pointing out that there are two mutually contradictory messages at the heart of the COVID-19 rollout. Just as Orwell describes in 1984, a major point of the exercise seems to be to get people to believe both at the same time. The first message is that COVID-19 is a terrifying, unique, and existential threat to the human race. This message is never sourced to much fact, because the facts about the virus don't really support it. If it cites anything solid, it's the appallingly sloppy and discredited imperial computer model or some generic research. It just tells people to be afraid, very afraid. The second message is that COVID-19 is actually pretty harmless and no big deal. Chris Whitty on the British government, he said on April 30th, at an individual level, the chances of dying of coronavirus are low. Over the whole epidemic, even if there's no vaccine, a high proportion will not get it. Of those who do, a significant portion, exact number not yet clear, have no symptoms. Of the symptomatic cases, the great majority, around 80%, a mild to moderate disease. And he said on May 11th, the great majority of people will not die from this, and I'll just repeat something I said right at the beginning because I think it's worth reinforcing. And then he goes on pretty much to say what he had said in April. It seems all the officials want to make that point really clearly, even while they behave as if it was not true. Why? There's plenty of room for speculation there, and we leave it to readers. The motives, though, are less important than the basic and undeniable fact. The fear currently gripping the public mind is being simultaneously encouraged and acknowledged as unnecessary by the bodies overseeing the response. And I'll just repeat that we have the confirmation from her own mouth that the chief medical officer of Queensland suspended schools when there was no medical reason to do so. She wanted to make a point. She wanted to throw her weight around. Sir Simon Jenkins writes in The Guardian, and it's interesting to see this piece in The Guardian. As Europe emerges from lockdown, the question hangs, was Sweden right? Who on earth is right? We cannot all be right. One country has all but dropped off the COVID-19 radar, Sweden. Just 2 months ago, it held hands with Britain in rejecting total lockdown and trusting social distancing. Then on March the 23rd, Boris Johnson did a U-turn, leaving Sweden and to a lesser extent Germany on its own. Since then, the divergence has become radical and political. Sweden's center-left government, darling of Bernie Sanders and world liberalism, is suddenly lauded by the libertarian right. Like millions, I've become an armchair epidemiologist. The reason is instinctive. I'm being ordered daily by my prime minister to live in fear of my life. I have come to exist in a miasma of R rates, antigen tests, infection fatality ratios, and excess deaths. Now, as Europe and the world emerge blearily to survey the wreckage of lockdown, the question is still left hanging, was Sweden right? The one table that glares at us daily is the International League table of deaths per million. Even if the aggregates are unreliable, there is a crude reality to a body count. Yet the only conclusion to be drawn from the figures is that the league table is no help to policy. And then he talks about the countries where they had the most stringent lockdowns have yielded both high and low deaths per million. High tech has apparently worked in South Korea, but so has no tech in Sweden. He writes, where I find Sweden's policy more of a gamble is in its faith in developing a collective immunity that will protect it from future outbreaks. Johan Giesecke talks of half of all Swedes probably infected in some degree, and tests suggest that a quarter of people in Stockholm have the virus and will probably, but by no means certainly, be protected against any resurgence. This compares with just 2% of people in Oslo. Well, yes, Britain now faces a challenge. I believe early criticism of Boris Johnson was unfair. He had a respectable case for proceeding on an evidence-based approach. Had he only concentrated his attention on the high-risk health and care sectors, in his U-turn, he opted for the politics of fear. He is now workers terrified of working and parents terrified of school. He has frightened his economy into inertia. You may have heard, well, every day at 7 o'clock, people are banging pots and pans. They have something similar in Britain, but once a week, they're supposed to go out on Thursday evening and clap for the National Health Service, because Britons are being instructed to protect the NHS, whereas, of course, the NHS is supposed to exist to protect Britons. James Dellingpole writes, though I'm never exactly sure what I'm going to be doing at 8 p.m. on a Thursday evening, drinking gin, rolling a cigarette, looking for owls or bats or swallows, there's one thing I know for certain that I shan't be doing. Every Thursday, without fail, for the entirety of the coronavirus pandemic, I have very carefully avoided participating in the deranged, sinister, and near compulsory practice of standing outside my house and clapping our NHS. I say near compulsory because I know that in towns and cities, entire streets come out for their ritual applause like clockwork every Thursday night. Neighbors quickly notice if you don't participate. It marks you down as a dangerous ingrate who deserves to be shunned. The fact that you don't care about the NHS or the heroism of its workers means you don't really deserve to be treated by the NHS should you ever fall ill, as you thoroughly deserve to do so for being such an ungrateful bastard. While I'm full of respect for those doctors and nurses who are working hard and sometimes risking their lives by exposing themselves to the powerful viral load which could trigger a particularly bad bout of COVID-19, I still don't think people should be clapped for doing their job, especially in a climate like the one now, where even to have a job is a privilege rather than cause for special sympathy. And he notes that the NHS is full of bureaucrats. And the Newcastle upon Tyne Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust is advertising for a climate change manager at a salary of £39,000 to £44,500 per year. Yes, a recruitment ad for one of the thousands of non-jobs in the NHS the taxpayer has to support. Having everyone clap the NHS puts this creaky socialistic health system on a pedestal not dissimilar to the one occupied by communist dictators like Kim Jong-un or President Xi of China. That puts it beyond criticism and therefore any reasonable hope of improvement. This is a bad thing. More worryingly, this outbreak of clapping appears to be a direct copy of a practice initially instituted in Wuhan, China. It is not British. Ritual compulsory applause is what commie regimes from Stalin's Soviet Union to Castro's Cuba to Xi's China do. He concludes, in the Free West, we are better than this. Well, I'm not so sure. The COVID-19 panic has proved beyond a doubt that for all this talk about liberty, freedom, and the like, we simply don't believe in it anymore. Lionel Shriver is a novelist. You have likely heard of her novel, We Need to Talk About Kevin, which was made into a movie. She writes in The Spectator, "This is not a natural disaster, but a man-made one. Should our future permit an occupation so frivolous, historians years from now will make a big mistake if they blame the nauseating plummet of global GDP in 2020 directly on a novel coronavirus. After all, forgive the repetition, but certain figures bear revisiting. COVID's roughly 290,000 deaths wouldn't raise a blip on a graph of worldwide mortality. Reminder, 58 million global deaths in 2019. COVID deaths will barely register in the big picture, even if their total multiplies by several times. For maintaining a precious sense of proportion, check out some other annual global fatalities. Influenza, 650,000. Typhoid fever, up to 160,000. Cholera, up to 140,000. Malaria, 620,000 in 2017, almost all in Africa. In 2018, tuberculosis, developing treacherous antibiotic resistance, killed 1.5 million people. Why haven't we closed down the whole world for TB? What is destroying lives and livelihoods is not predominantly the illness. The UK economy is not in a tailspin because it can't survive without the labor of the 32,000 plus fatalities, however much we may miss them as individuals. Now, politics, as opposed to science, does not reward the correction of mistakes, given that correcting a mistake also entails admitting to having made one. Worse, the bigger the mistake, the greater political urgency of defending it at all costs. Boris and company are therefore obliged to keep justifying the lockdown, which means continuing to exaggerate the contagion's risk to life. Case in point, in Sunday's address to the nation, the Prime Minister reiterated Professor Pantsdown's, that would be a Neil Ferguson, forecast of 500,000 fatalities, although that modeling has been much discredited. I am steeped in dread. I foresee months, if not years, of inane gesturing towards safety that makes no appreciable difference to the nation's health, but does manage to, one, ruin everyone's enjoyment, two, perpetuate the socially poisonous notion that one's neighbor is a threat to one's very life, and three, maintain an atmosphere of the extraordinary in which the state may violate civil rights at will, and four, lay waste to what little might otherwise have remained of this country's economy. The lockdown has been bad enough. Post-lockdown could be worse. Recent research suggests that COVID is surprisingly nosocomial, spread in the healthcare settings of care homes and hospitals. We've also learned that most infections result from the close-up sustained exposure that we never get with strangers in supermarkets. Yet the 2-meter rule that's consigned us to half-mile lines for the store will soon make everywhere else unbearable too. With narrow profit margins, restaurants can't survive serving a fraction of their previous clientele. Half of all UK pubs are already kaput, and the other half will soon go under if lone customers self-isolate over their drinks like sullen alcoholics. Plenty of manufacturing won't function with an employee so far apart. The arts are finished. West End theaters with audiences a third their former size will close. The Albert Hall is also looking at social distancing bankruptcy, as well as considering the banning of intervals because the loos will have to be shut. Sounds relaxing. The Royal Opera House's streaming of Swan Lake without a live audience makes no money. Oh, and transport. In London, social distancing is expected to reduce tube passenger numbers by 90%. 5 million people daily ride the tube, or used to, so how are the other 4.5 million meant to get around? By bicycle, right. Now, I can assure you that pre-COVID-19, it was already a nightmare to cycle in the capital, as choco with two-wheelers as the old Shanghai. But forget buses, allowed to carry 15% of the previous ridership. We're told that to get into a sparsely populated lift, we may have to make a reservation on an app. But never fear. I guess we could always throw ourselves off the balcony instead. Why, with the masky, glovey, get away from me future we're all facing, taking that shortest route to the pavement starts to appeal. I predict that few of the tedious, costly, time-consuming measures about to be levied on the British public in the coming months will be based on science. We'll be obliged to make loud gestures of showy compliance, most of which will make no difference to who sickens and who dies, but which will nevertheless irretrievably deep six the UK economy and make our daily lives an unremitting misery. Well put. Let's go to the chat here. Lots of comments. Lots and lots of comments. MCT, remember when Friday was when you got home from work and had the weekend? Yeah, me neither. YT says, New York City lockdown extended until May 29th for non-essential people. Well, I made a prediction near the beginning. You can find it on Twitter. That's come true. I made this prediction several months ago that first we had, We had non-essential jobs, and this process would result in non-essential people. And we found out who the non-essential people are. They are the people in nursing homes, long-term care homes. These people have been killed in very large numbers because of deliberate policies. Now, the policies were deliberate. The intent behind them, I can't say. But if, I'm not saying that there was a test, but this has been the result. Don from Beyond says, well, out dashing yesterday, I drove past the high school. The huge parking lots were full of orange cones, pop-up shades, and camo uniformed soldiers. Walrus Libertarian says, plenty of work to be had on OnlyFans. This has become a meme with such rapidity. The idea that, in the future or any day now, all women are going to be selling pictures of themselves, intimate pictures of themselves. Maybe it will come true. Stranger things have happened. Respectable commenting name says, it's selfish of me to say, but lockdown has been fun. I'm out most every day getting death glares from women in masks, big grins from guys who aren't wearing them. I don't know. My own experience has been somewhat different. It is really disconcerting, I suppose, because, I have gray hair, that people will literally jump out of the way when I walk down the street, or they'll walk upstairs, they'll walk into traffic in order to avoid me, because, I guess if you get within 2 meters of another person, you're going to die. And it's very stressful. There's no question about it. To realize that that you are held in fear and contempt by others. David Wright says, I guess the lockdown has shown many people how much they hate their jobs. I suppose that's true, but I suppose it would be worse not to have a job at all, certainly for most people. I remember when I was working at CJCA in Edmonton in 1993, the station, despite having 13% audience share, was losing money hand over fist. And so there was fear that it was going to be shut down, and then the station was bought, and the would-be new owner got a look at the financials, and then he decided he was not, in fact, going to buy it. And the pressure was very, very great. Is this the day we're all going to get the chop? And this went on for several months, and then in the middle of December, we all got the chop. And before that, I'd been thinking, oh, just get it over with. And then afterwards, I thought, man, I sure missed that paycheck. Now I'm going to have to find another job. I already had a job. Now I have to find a different one. Chad Chadson, our moderator, says Doctor Who is a she. Now I'm going to be talking about that in a little while. Philadelphia's chief medical officer, John from Beyond, I learned that the National Guard is holding COVID testing at the site, completely drive-through. I didn't see any cars there waiting at all. Let's see, major disappointment, only 70 people took advantage so far. Yeah, the way that people are acting over this suggests that they're not as afraid as they say they are. Because if you were terrified of getting the virus, well, you'd want to know if you'd had it, because then you could be treated. But I don't know, perhaps people are afraid that if they get the virus, they're going to be put in situations where they are likely to die. Let's see, Claire Koss says how the matriarchy reacts to the pandemic is very telling. Well, the price of matriarchy is eternal panic, as I have said. Yes, by the age of 7, we will give you a neurotic, says David Wright. YT says the sight of men acting all scared of the virus and letting the authorities make decisions about their lives has been difficult and disappointing to observe. Men reduced to children willingly. Well, Christopher Lash pointed out some decades ago that for, 120 years or so, our life has been increasingly controlled by so-called experts. That all of the folk wisdom of the people was to be disregarded, that it was dangerous. I suppose to give the most famous example, in the 1950s, a fellow called Dr. Benjamin Spock brought out a book on child rearing, and this book sold tens of millions of copies, and he was an expert, supposedly. So forget what your mother or grandmother told you. It's all here in this book, and if you don't follow the book, then you are a bad person. Chogokin666, the Cuomos are really deserving of some serious comeuppance, and I'm going to get to them very, very shortly. 219 more subscribers than we can do super chats. How much does YouTube take from super chats? It's a rather large amount, I think. It's somewhere between 25 and 40%, something like that. Let's see. M. Barron says, I see so many people wearing masks while driving where I live. I laugh every time. Metal Mike says there could be a good reason for wearing a mask while driving. Certainly, if one is alone in the car, I can't possibly imagine what the reason would be. Laramie Hirsch says, in response to Claire Caw, Islam will not defeat the West matriarchy, but certainly the solution will not be political. If you went into an elevator, do get to your car in an apartment building, and then you are planning on driving to a grocery store, for example. Albus Dumbledore says, I didn't clap, I just threw eggs. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. Well, yes, the body takes in vitamin D, naturally, from sunshine. You can also get it in pill form. But fresh air. There's kind of a mania about this. When I was young, I remember being kicked out of the house in the summer, as were, all my classmates. You need some fresh air and exercise. That typically, if I hadn't left the house by noon, I was evicted and basically, told to come back at dinner time. Not that I wanted to watch television in the afternoon in any event, at least until 3 o'clock when the cartoons came back, because it was all soap operas, and I've always hated soap operas. Dawn from Beyond says the mask collects your own germs, and then you keep breathing them in again and again. These silly masks are the tinfoil hats approved by the majority. Yes, I guess they are. British American says, is Barr actually running cover for the deep state? If not, a cleansing rain of indictments must come soon. Are with us, Barr? Yes, then the time is now. Well, he's a very careful man, and we've already got considerable results from his team, and I'm in no hurry so long as this actually does happen. I noticed that the people at Zero Hedge have become completely black-pilled. Today they were suggesting that Trump wants to start a war with China in order to draw attention away from the corona virus, which sounds crazy to me. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. UN officials suggest lockdowns should continue. This is the UN Human Rights High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet. The Human Rights High Commissioner is saying that people should be imprisoned in their homes. She tweeted, if the reopening of societies is mishandled, all the huge sacrifices made during the initial lockdown will have been for nothing. Letting politics, boo, or economics, boo, drive the COVID-19 response at the expense of health and human rights will cost lives. Again, she mentioned human rights, that the human rights thing to do is to lock people into their homes. And she said that she suggested that the drive to lift lockdown is motivated by the interests of a particular elite, which is absolutely hilarious. One doesn't know whether to laugh or cry. Oh, I see. It's the elite that wants the lockdown lifted. Paul Joseph Watson comments, in reality, the backlash against the lockdown comprises of the very vulnerable people Bachelet claims to speak for, many of whom are amongst the 36 million Americans who have lost their jobs. Another story from Summit News, this time from Steve Watson, and this is absolutely bizarre. A EU-funded comic book predicted pandemic with globalists as saviors. And there's a panel here. Good morning, everyone. Most of you know me already. My name is Chang Wenlong, and I'm Dr. De La Mancha's assistant. Since I'm a Chinese national, I've been selected to take you on a special tour of this high-security P4 medical research laboratory. A strange comic book that was commissioned for publication by the EU in 2012 eerily predicted almost exactly what has unfolded with the COVID-19 global pandemic. However, in this propaganda-laced presentation of the outbreak, unelected globalist bureaucrats saved the planet. The comic book, titled Infected, was a production of the European Commission's International Cooperation and Development arm. It was not intended for widespread public consumption, but instead to be distributed inside EU institutions. Only a few hundreds of the comic books were made. The EU's description of the strange publication states that, quote, while the story may be fictional, it is nevertheless intertwined with some factual information, unquote. The graphic novel depicts scientists inside a lab in China experimenting with deadly pathogens. A wannabe hero time travels from the future, alerting authorities to the coming pandemic, and presents an antidote before quickly becoming the target of opportunists who want to steal the cure and sell it to drug companies. The story features the transmission of a novel virus from animals to humans in a crowded wet market. Indeed, imagine if you were infected in this market by a new contagious agent, says the UN's chief advisor on contagious diseases, adding, you probably wouldn't even realize it until the end of the incubation period. The publication suggests that air travel would exacerbate the spread of the disease, with the character adding that you'd have headed back to Europe, the US, Latin America, or Australia as planned via an international airport. The cartoon depicts the failure of a global health organization to act quickly enough to stop a global pandemic. It also predicts draconian safety measures, including social distancing, which make everyday life, quote, totally unbearable, unquote. The piece concludes with a EU Parliament hearing in which Brussels pushes for more integrated European cooperation on global health matters, mirroring a real-life initiative known as One Health. The globalists are lauded for helping develop and distribute a vaccine to the world. Was this predictive programming or just a bizarre coincidence? In 2020, in reality, the EU has pandered to China and bowed to censorship regarding the virus outbreak. The EU has also been heavily criticized by member states and insiders for monumental failings owing to internal bureaucracy. The EU science chief even resigned due to the inept coronavirus response from the institution. In the bureaucrat's own fiction, globalism saves the planet. In reality, it ends in mass death and global tyranny. Brendan O'Neill has a piece in Spiked. The media. People are turning on the media, both in Britain and in the United States, New York State in particular. The media in this country have no shame. For 2 months, they've been ramping up fear and hysteria over COVID-19. They predicted apocalypse. They reported the daily death tolls like gleeful, grim reapers. They said hospitals would be overwhelmed. They interviewed doctor after doctor and nurse after nurse who told us in tearful tones that the health service was at breaking point. They painted a picture of a nation falling apart, of a plague visiting death upon every community, of institutions collapsing under the sheer weight of this mini Black Death. And now, after all that, after pumping out 24-hour rolling doom for weeks on end, they have the gall to wonder why so many people have been too scared to visit a hospital during the pandemic, and why there has been a huge number of excess deaths from treatable ailments other than COVID-19, and why there was a policy of protecting the NHS at all costs from the coming viral calamity that involved sending even infected elderly people away from hospital and back to care homes. How could this happen? They cry. To which our response should be because of you. Because you played a central role in spreading dread and terror about COVID-19, and this encouraged some people and officialdom itself to behave in unwise ways. Channel 4 News interviewed a poorly 95-year-old woman who said she is too scared to visit a hospital. She said that, like everyone, she is terrified of coronavirus. The reporter looked startled and concerned. There will have to be a serious analysis at some point in the future as to why even ill people avoided health services during the pandemic, she said. Let's not wait until the future. Let's talk about it now. The media, including you, Channel 4 News, fed us ceaseless horror stories from hospitals and tales of doom about the wiping out of the elderly and grim predictions of hundreds of thousands of deaths. So that 95-year-old lady's reluctance to visit a hospital actually makes sense, even if it could prove potentially bad for health if she were to take a turn for the worse. Yeah, I mentioned already that Luke Johnson was brave enough to appear on the BBC and speak out against the policies of Boris Johnson. He said, here's some of the comments that he made. You are more likely to drown. There's 400 people a year that drown. We have to get things a bit in context. He said only 350 people below the age of 60 and without other morbidities have died from COVID-19 in the UK. He said, in fact, it's not one recession. The Bank of England have said the economy will shrink by 14%. That's the equivalent of 2 recessions. It's a depression. And I wouldn't be surprised if we have 2 million more unemployed people within the year. Imagine the agony of 2 million more people. How many deaths might flow from that? How many deaths have been flowing because of the fact that we've got half as many A&E appointments at the moment? So we had another whistleblower. I mentioned him yesterday, and we're allowed to say his name. His name is Dr. Rick Bright. I'm always curious about people who, this is a high official in government, and he calls himself Rick rather than Richard. Yes, in private, sure, by all means, but it doesn't really inspire confidence, at least to me. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany said the HHS whistleblower, Dr. Rick Bright, should show up for the job he has after he testified to Congress that hypertension and stress have kept him out of work since his controversial demotion. He takes a $285,000 salary. That's extraordinary for a federal government salary, and he is still on taxpayer-funded medical leave so he can work with partisan attorneys who malign the president, McEnany said at Friday's press briefing. I like this woman very much. And it is I think it's a very legitimate question that why is he being paid not to work? Let's get to Andrew Cuomo, the Love Gov, or Governor Death, as I prefer to call him. This is from Breitbart. Andrew Cuomo finds himself engulfed in scandal as a growing number of Democrats join state Republicans in demanding an independent investigation into his controversial policies and how questionable actions may have contributed to the catastrophic outbreak of coronavirus in New York nursing homes. More details have emerged in recent days, raising major questions about potentially fatal decisions made under Cuomo's watch as the death toll in New York's nursing homes swells to over 5,300 and continues to climb. The center of the storm surrounds a controversial March 25th directive prohibiting nursing homes from testing recovering hospital patients prior to intake. This while Cuomo's aides reportedly quietly worked to shield nursing homes from lawsuits due to coronavirus following lobbying by industry representatives. The March 25th executive order stated nursing homes are prohibited from requiring a hospitalized resident who is determined medically stable to be tested for COVID-19 prior to admission or readmission. Last week, New York suddenly disclosed more than 1,700 previously unreported deaths at nursing homes and adult care facilities. An Associated Press tally put the number of nursing home virus deaths at over 5,300. Elderly care fatalities in New York have reportedly been on the rise by an average of 20 to 25 deaths per day for several weeks. Cuomo is under more scrutiny after the New York Times revealed that his aides quietly inserted a provision on page 347 of New York's final voluminous budget bill that provided what the newspaper characterized as unusual legal protections for nursing home operators. And of course, it was Cuomo's own directive that put infected people, that removed them from hospitals and put them in nursing homes, thus infecting every nursing home. Pretty much close to 100% rate of infection. And we know that very old people are at the highest risk for fatalities. And so Cuomo's order was essentially a death sentence for thousands of people. Amid the ensuing outcry, Cuomo established an inquiry under the auspices of his own health department, as well as the Office of New York Attorney General Letitia James, a Democrat. That led to Republicans calling for an independent probe. New York Assemblyman Ron Kim, a Democrat, savaged Cuomo on Twitter. The governor's flip-flopping policies on nursing homes must be held accountable. First, they tried to keep the virus out by denying access. Then they tell unprepared facilities to take in COVID-19 patients. Now they are back to keeping the virus out again. It's fine to have the health department and the attorney general looking at what individual nursing homes are doing, but there needs to be a professional review of not only the industry as a whole, but what the Department of Health has been doing, both leading up to this situation and in the midst of this situation, said New York Assemblyman Richard Gottfried, a Democrat. Certainly, it would be wrong for the Department of Health to be charged with examining itself. The Attorney General should bring in outside counsel. And chiming in was State Senator Gustavo Rivera, a Democrat from the Bronx, who said the state legislature should investigate. The massive number of dead prompted Cuomo earlier this week to issue a series of new regulations, including requiring staff at all nursing homes to take 2 virus tests per week. He also said that hospitals can no longer send coronavirus patients to nursing homes. A little late in the day, one might say. And Alex Berenson comments, hey, remember when Governor Cuomo said he wouldn't accept a premise that human life is disposable and promised to save every life we can? Yeah, about that. Times change. Am I right? And he is, well, let's get what he previously said first. We are going to fight every way we can to save every life that we can. That's what it means to be an American, and that's what it means to be a New Yorker. That was March the 25th. And what he now is, he says, my mother's not expendable. We're not going to accept a premise that human life is disposable, and we're not going to put a dollar figure on human life. Now, he is saying, as a society, you can't save everyone. You're going to lose people. That's life, Cuomo said in a press briefing and soon to reopen Watertown in upstate New York. But we did everything that we could. Cuomo repeated that conscience-clearing mantra, or a close variation of it, 6 times in a matter of seconds when grilled specifically about a lack of diagnostic tests, making it impossible for some nursing homes to comply with this new edict that all workers be screened twice weekly. He's following up on the same thing they did with the nursing homes. You know, he blamed the nursing homes for what happened, and the nursing homes told him, we do not have enough PPE. We do not have space to keep these people that you've ordered us to take in isolation. And Cuomo went ahead with it anyway. He has blood on his hands. From the Daily Caller, New York admits knowingly undercounting nursing home deaths after quietly changing reporting rules. The New York State Department of Health acknowledged that its recent reporting does not fully reflect the known carnage coronavirus has caused among nursing home and adult care residents. New York is the only state with large coronavirus outbreaks among its long-term care facilities that doesn't count residents who died at a hospital. New York quietly changed the way that it reports long-term care fatalities around April the 28th. How about that? The New York State Department of Health confirmed that until April 28th, it was disclosing coronavirus deaths for all nursing home and adult care facility residents, regardless of whether the patient died at their long-term care facility or a hospital. New York's coronavirus tracker currently does not include out-of-facility deaths, a spokeswoman said. In other words, New York's nursing home and adult care facility coronavirus death trackers omits any individuals who contracted coronavirus while living at a long-term care facility but died in a hospital. The reporting change has in fact resulted in inconsistencies in New York's disclosure of long-term care coronavirus fatalities, particularly regarding deaths of residents of adult care facilities, which don't typically have the medical capacity of nursing homes or hospitals. So these numbers, what in New York, what they're going to be yo-yoing up and down. I think it's going to be, I think Cuomo's honeymoon with America is coming to a swift end. There's a story from Mediaite, and there's a picture of a man with a mask on. A local news correspondent was subjected to verbal abuse, threats, and was even stalked while trying to report from a demonstration protesting the lockdown in New York State Thursday. Kevin Vesey, a reporter for News 12 Long Island, posted the footage to his Twitter feed Thursday evening. It depicted an unruly group of protesters in the Comac section of Long Island hurling verbal barbs at him while he was trying to file a live report. "Go home, you're fake news," one protester said. "Traitor," another shouted. "You are the virus," another said. Kevin was quite put out at this. His feelings have been gravely injured. He tweeted, "The level of anger directed at the media from these protesters was alarming. As always, I will tell a fair and unbiased story today." The protesters at one point chanted, "Fake news is not essential." VZ posted a video showing one of the demonstrators refusing to keep his distance. "Can you please stay away from me, sir?" VZ asked the man. "This is 6 feet," the man replied. "You're not 6 feet," VZ shot back. "Measure," the man shouted. Later, that same man stalked VZ as he attempted to retreat. "I think you need to back away from me, sir," VZ said. "No, I've got hydroxychloroquine. I'm fine," the man replied. Oh, yes, I mentioned a person called Jennifer Levine or Levine. I don't know how it is pronounced. This is from Coburn in The Spectator. "Misgendering is the real COVID crisis. Pennsylvania health director's follies go unnoticed due to trans activism." If it's true that coronavirus is less likely to kill people with high levels of testosterone, Dr. Rachel Levine, the Secretary of Health for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, may be in luck. Dr. Levine, who is leading the state's response to the coronavirus epidemic, asked local radio host Marty Griffin to stop misgendering her after he accidentally called her sir several times during a press call on Tuesday. "It's really insulting," Levine added, prompting Griffin to apologize and insist it was not malicious. But it was too late. The leftist mob was already on its way to claim Griffin's head. Griffin begged for forgiveness on Twitter. I apologized twice. I truly did. It was not intentional. I was not focused. I was doing 6 things at once." Sorry doesn't cut it, Marty. Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto canceled an interview with Griffin's station later that day, saying he would not support their behavior. Unfortunately, Griffin's error has detracted from the fact that Levine is facing real scrutiny for her leadership on COVID-19 for several reasons. For one, Levine is not an infectious disease expert. Her medical background is in pediatrics and psychiatry. For another, Levine moved her mother out of a nursing home and into a hotel, even as other COVID-positive patients were forced back into nursing homes. The majority of Pennsylvania coronavirus deaths, by the way, have occurred in senior care facilities. But in spite of the nursing home misstep, countless are rising to Levine's defense over the brutal misgendering she suffered at the hands of Griffin. Over the past few days, a sea of virtue signalers have been tweeting "Respect for Rachel," while members of a Facebook page named Dr. Rachel Levine, "We love you," call Levine our sweet angel on earth and Pennsylvania's calming mother. Mother, eh? This person was born without a uterus, and there's no such thing as a artificial uterus. So how she could be described as a mother is rather curious. One particularly egregious column by Giulio Taruso of the Philadelphia Inquirer, entitled "Pennsylvania's Health Secretary Rachel Levine Fights Hate, Fear, and the Coronavirus," lauded Levine for calmly announcing death toll statistics with an instructional sing-song lilt. Based on that description, Marvel might as well announce Levine's debut superhero flick. As Levine is now one of the most prominent transgender politicians in the nation, an abundance of articles and opinion pieces have been surfacing about hate speech directed toward her. Forget the additional 3 million Americans who filed for unemployment this week and the nearly 90,000 dead in the United States alone. America just needs to be talking about pronouns. Again. Yes, I've noticed this on Twitter, that the alphabet people are in rather a state. You're not paying enough attention to us. Attention must be paid. It's like every Saturday or every Sunday is there's some hashtag that it's Alphabet People Day. I mean, what, they have a whole month now, but apparently that is not sufficient. Oh, yes, I mentioned this yesterday. Colorado health officials claim drunk man died of coronavirus when his blood alcohol content was 7 times the legal limit. Montezuma County coroner George Devers found that Sebastian Yellow, 35, who tested positive for COVID-19, had died of acute alcohol poisoning. Devers' investigation determined Yellow's blood alcohol content was 0.55, which is just staggering. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, however, categorized Yellow's death as being due to COVID-19, and the information was used to up the state's death tally from the virus. I see no reason for this, Devers told KCNC. The coroner's challenge of how Yellow's death was blamed on the coronavirus when, in fact, he died from drinking comes as the state has come under scrutiny for reclassifying deaths contrary to what doctors have already determined. An investigation found state health officials reclassified 3 deaths at a Centennial nursing home as COVID-19 after attending doctors ruled they were not related to coronavirus. Each of the dead residents had tested positive for the coronavirus, but their passing was blamed on other causes by the physicians. Yes, gotta keep those numbers up. Gotta get those numbers higher and higher and higher. I suspect that there's going to be some sort of grand celebration in the media when the numbers top 100,000. And they've gone too far. And it appears there might actually be consequences. A Republican state representative asked prosecutors to bring criminal charges against Colorado's top public health official Thursday, claiming that she illegally falsified death records to inflate COVID-19 death tolls. Representative Mark Baisley issued a formal letter requesting an investigation and criminal charges by George Brouchler, district attorney for the 18th Judicial District. Baisley accused Jill Ryan, executive director of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, of falsely altering death certificates. This department collects and reports COVID-19 statistics from across Colorado. And they say that Colorado is approaching 1,100 known deaths from complications of the virus. Falsely inflating the number of deaths due to COVID-19 adversely impacts the professional reputation of nursing homes, hospitals, and healthcare workers, while creating undue fear for families, Baisley wrote. He provided a letter dated April 17th from the Summer and Glen Senior Care Facility to its staff, residents, and residents' families. The letters said the Colorado Department had overruled the cause of death findings by attending physicians in order to list 7 deaths as being caused by COVID-19. We have never seen a situation where the health department overrules the physician's findings, Baisley says. However, these are unprecedented times, and the health department officials did not share their motivation for changing physicians' orders. So the wreckage, how bad is the wreckage going to be? Well, U.S. retail sales plunged 16.4% in April amid virus closures. This is from Agence France-Presse. The drop was the largest recorded in the history of the survey and much worse than expected, with massive contractions reported in an array of retailers, including clothing, furniture, electronics, and appliances, and food and drinking places, all of which declined by double digits. The index had sunk by 8.3% in March, but April's survey was the first to reflect a full month of lockdowns imposed to stem the spread of the virus. National Retail Federation CEO Matthew Shea said the report was not a surprise given the current state of affairs, but predicted a rebound. I saw somewhere a prediction that 25% of America's restaurants are they're never coming back. At least, I just it seems to be that there are many, in my own town of Victoria, there are many, non-essential businesses which have been shut for months now, and I know that a great many of these businesses are never going to reopen. But what's the old joke? That the Chinese character for risk is the same as that of opportunity, or as Homer Simpson said, "Cracetunity." This is from Breitbart. Santa Ana, California is experiencing a surge in crime as suspects exploit a national recommendation to wear masks to prevent the spread of the Chinese coronavirus. The Santa Ana Police Department told CBS News Los Angeles that the city has seen a 50% spike in robberies since Governor Gavin Newsom announced a sweeping stay-at-home order in March. Speaking to the news outlet, one gas station clerk recounted how he was held up at gunpoint by a masked thief last Friday at 2 a.m. The clerk said the suspect didn't arouse suspicion because mask coverings are now the norm, allowing the thief to catch him off guard when he pulled the gun on him and took his cash before getting away in a silver Nissan Altima. It's horrible, the clerk lamented. I mean, I know we have to take certain measures because of what's happening with COVID-19, but it's the perfect script or manual for a robber. The mask, the sunshade, and a hoodie. You don't know who's coming, who's walking in. In April, one thief using a bandana to cover his face robbed a donut shop. On Bristol, the suspect emptied both registers before fleeing the scene. It's the norm, conceded Corporal Anthony Britannia. We're seeing more and more suspects wearing the mask and using that to their benefit. The concerning crime figure comes after Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti announced that residents must wear masks when leaving their homes as part of the city's ongoing effort to combat the coronavirus pandemic. And as long as you're not doing a solitary activity or within your own household, put that mask on. Always now. New York City. Is New York City going to be wrecked by the sanitary dictatorship? This rather surprised me. Story from the Daily Mail. Nearly 420,000 of New York City's richest residents have fled the city amid the pandemic, with smartphone data showing Upper East Side and West Village populations down by 40%. Neighborhoods such as the Upper East Side, Soho, and the West Village, the majority fled to vacation homes in places such as Long Island, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, the Jersey Shore, and Florida. Residents who fled typically were white, had rents of more than $2,000 per month, had college degrees or higher, and earned incomes of more than $100,000. New York City is home to 8.4 million people. Anyone who knows anything about renting an apartment in New York City knows how much you pay for a tiny amount of space and how crummy in all sorts of ways these apartments are. This leads me to suspect that people who've been told that they can work at home have decided, oh, you mean I can leave here and I can go to a place that is much less horrible and pay much less money? I suspect that's part of it. Other districts affected, the West Village, Morningside Heights, the Upper East Side, the Financial District, Midtown, Gramercy, and Brooklyn Heights. Manhattan's overall population has fallen by almost 20%. Income was perhaps the strongest indicator of how many residents in a particular neighborhood had fled. New York became a horrible place in the 1970s, and a great many people left. Parts of it looked like a ghost town. And then it almost went under. Ford to New York City dropped dead. But then it made a comeback. And but I wonder if it's how it's going to come back from this. Particularly if Cuomo decides that he's going to humiliate people for as long as possible. I'm looking at this article which I referred to earlier about a paean to Jeanette Young, the woman leading Queensland's fight against COVID-19. I don't know that this is significant, but I've never seen a woman with as hair bad as this woman. It looks like that she has fried it by continually dyeing it. It's dyeing it blonde. It is absolutely frightful. So, some good news from the Mail, actually AFP and Reuters. U.S. officials moved Friday to cut off Chinese tech giant Huawei from global chip makers, ramping up sanctions on the company, seen by Washington as a national security risk. The move is part of a ramping up of attacks on China, with Donald Trump and his administration accusing it of being culpable for the spread of coronavirus. Hostility to China is set to be a central theme in his re-election campaign. Now, given the figures that I quoted the other day from Canada, if Canadians feel that a certain way, that is to say, highly negatively about China, I can only imagine how strong the feelings are in the United States. The Commerce Department said it was broadening its sanctions enforcement to include semiconductor designs that are developed using U.S. software and technology. Officials said Huawei had been circumventing sanctions by obtaining chips and components that are produced around the world based on U.S. technology. This announcement cuts off Huawei's efforts to undermine U.S. export controls, the Commerce Department said. This action puts America first, American companies first, and American national security first. The U.S. government will wait and see if China retaliates. And what? Boeing, Apple, Cisco Systems, and Qualcomm apparently could be in trouble in China. China said it is ready to put U.S. companies in an unreliable entity list as part of countermeasures against Washington's move. According to the Global Times, which is published by the People's Daily, the official newspaper of China's ruling Communist Party. This is very good news indeed, because I don't know, if you trade with China, they're going to steal your intellectual property. They're going to force you to reveal it, and if you won't, they'll steal it. And as I mentioned earlier, Zero Hedge seems to be losing its rag over this. In deep state news, it's from Breitbart. Fox News' Ed Henry reported Tuesday evening that Acting Director of National Intelligence Richard Grenell has declassified information calling into question the conclusion that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to help Donald Trump. Henry told Tucker Carlson that the new information would suggest that John Brennan, he is the Cro-Magnon looking man, who headed the Central Intelligence Agency under Obama, also had intel saying actually Russia wanted Clinton to win because she was a known quantity. She had been Secretary of State, and Vladimir Putin's team thought she was more malleable, while candidate Donald Trump was unpredictable. Former National Security Council Chief of Staff Fred Fleitz made a similar claim in an article on Fox News on April the 22nd. Breitbart News noted in 2017 the Russians may just as well have preferred Hillary Clinton, who had given Russia everything it wanted while serving as President Barack Obama's Secretary of State, from the ill-fated reset to a surrender of U.S. missile defenses in Eastern Europe to the sale of 20% of America's uranium reserves to a Russian company closely tied to the Russian state. And of course, the Clinton Foundation got a big donation from those who had benefited, which I'm sure is entirely a coincidence. Oh, more good news from AFP. U.S. federal and state antitrust enforcers are preparing a lawsuit against Google, which could come this year, focusing on the tech giant's dominance of online advertising, the Wall Street Journal reported Friday. The report, citing anonymous sources, said the case may also address how Google uses its dominant search business to stifle competition. The U.S. Justice Department and 50 attorneys general last year said they were looking into whether Google abused its power in the online ecosystem at the expense of rivals or consumers. By doing so, the officials revived an antitrust probe closed in Washington several years earlier, while EU and other authorities pressed their own cases against the California-based firm. Google said it was continuing discussions with authorities. I don't know, perhaps Google would be willing to do some horse trading. Perhaps they could give people back their freedom of speech. That should surely count for something. And where are we going to next? Oh, yes. I wondered, the people who are the apostles of, for the immigrants and the migrants, I've always wondered, how much of a sexual interest they take in these newcomers. Now, this is from Summit News, Paul Joseph Watson. A pro-refugee activist in France was found dead at his home after being murdered by the same 20-year-old Afghan migrant he had been sleeping with. 63-year-old Jean Ducine was head of a group called Itinérance that helps vulnerable migrants. The activist also personally allowed some of the migrants to stay at his home. According to West France, Ducine was found dead at his home, having been viciously beaten with an iron rod as he slept. By an African migrant, barely 20 years old. The migrant, who cannot speak French, was taken into custody by police. Authorities are still trying to determine a motive for the killing. I'm going to suggest a possible motive that if it is suggested to you that you get free lodging and food in exchange for sex, this could breed resentment. National File reports, sadly, a similar story took place last year where a promising medical student and pro-migrant activist, also from Normandy, was stabbed to death by a migrant she was reportedly housing. Back in 2016, it was revealed that Open Borders activists were sleeping with refugees, some of them children, at the Calais migrant camp. After he was anally raped by a Somalian migrant in 2016, Norwegian refugee activist Karsten Nordal Hauken said he felt guilt and responsibility that the migrant was deported for his crime. Let's talk about Joe Biden. Let's talk about Joe, who is stumbling towards the finish line. I don't know. I'm reminded of Full Metal Jacket. That he can't make the march on his own. He's going to have someone drag him. A woman called, I don't know how this is pronounced. She has an Aztec Christian name. Is it Xochitl? Xochitl. Hinojosa. I looked her up. She's a very white-looking woman, a conquistador American, as Steve Saylor would say. Anyway, she is the communications director for the Democratic National Committee. She sparked confusion this week after stating during an appearance on Fox News that it is crucial for the party to hold its convention because they are not officially nominating Joe Biden in order to take Donald Trump. Now, that doesn't make any sense, but here we go. Quote, there's a real possibility the convention does not happen or it happens in a virtual sense. Is that correct as of today? Unquote. Fox News anchor Bill Hemmer asked. Now, these are her exact words. First of all, our convention has to happen because we are not officially nominating Joe Biden in order to take Donald Trump. So our convention is happening. There is business that has to happen. This suggests to me that this woman is stupid, or perhaps her first language is not, in fact, English, because we are not officially nominating Joe Biden in order to take Donald Trump. I have literally no idea what that means. Biden he became the Democratic Party's presumptive nominee following Bernie Sanders' departure from the race, as he was the last challenger standing. Sanders vowed prior to dropping out that he would support the eventual Democrat nominee, a promise he fulfilled last month. The DNC rescheduled the party's July convention to August, citing coronavirus-related concerns. This week, the Rules and Bylaws Committee voted to grant convention organizers in Milwaukee the authority to design an event that won't require delegates to attend in person amid the coronavirus pandemic. According to DNC Chair Tom Perez, every delegate is able to accomplish their official business without putting their own health at risk, whether that is participating in person or by other means to allow for social distancing. One of the reasons why people are required to go to a convention is that you have, physical evidence of that it's these people actually voting. You see, in the same way that people are required to go to voting booths for elections, because this person claiming to be such and such has voted. If this all becomes remote, there will never be a free and fair election again. This is from the Mail. Bumbling Joe Biden gaffes his way through a COVID-19 roundtable as he claims 85,000 jobs have been lost in the U.S. and millions of Americans have died since the pandemic began, instead of the other way round. The self-proclaimed gaffe machine did little to mitigate those apprehensions, stuttering his way through a segment about unemployment. The former vice president appears to have got his numbers confused. In reality, at least 85,000 Americans have died, while 36.5 million have lost their jobs. President Trump has routinely poked fun at Biden over his well-documented stumbles, suggesting he is mentally unfit to hold office. Biden told Governor Gretchen Whitmer she's done one hell of a job leading her state through the coronavirus pandemic, fueling rumors she could appear on his 2020 ticket. Please, 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 please. I want Governor Botox to be Biden's pick, but everyone seems, I don't know, what I've seen suggested that he's almost certain to pick a black woman, probably Kamala Harris, curious woman who was raised in Montreal, Canada, graduated from Westmount High School. Neither of her parents are American, and she spent her formative years from, I believe, 6 to 17 in Montreal. Not very American, seems to me. Joe Biden, he's the master politician. He says women probably shouldn't vote for me if they believe Tara Reid's sexual assault claim against him. And then he says he does not even remember her. He was being interviewed by Lawrence O'Donnell of MSNBC. He said Reid's claims of sexual assault against him should be taken seriously. He denies all the allegations and says that her story changes considerably. Ooh, that's a very dangerous thing for a man to say, but an accusation, because that is an old, cliche. I just, you got to take this seriously, and if you believe her, don't vote for me. This is not the way that successful politicians talk. And I'm looking at a screen capture of his Joker-like face. Again, he has had so much plastic surgery that he looks as if, if he were to open his eyes too wide or such like, his skin would split. What a clown. Let's look at the chat. Oh, yes, I saw a picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg being sworn in as a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And guess who's sniffing her hair? Yep, Joe Biden. Laramie Hirsch, do you think that Trump will overcome his germophobia and resist forcibly vaccinating citizens? Well, Trump was talking today about a vaccine being available by the end of the year and being, rushed out to Americans. I think that was foolish of him because there's never been a coronavirus vaccine. And we don't know if there'll ever be one. Oliver Eternus says, nobody trusts the government anymore, UK, US. I don't know about that. There seems to be, people are in a state of cognitive dissonance. That again, apparently, the polls say that people approve of the lockdown, but I see all these people on the street not wearing masks. Of course, a lot of these people have dogs on leashes, and it struck me a few weeks ago that apparently taking the dog out for a walk is considered, acceptable. You got to take the dog out for a walk. Of course, it allows the dog walker to get exercise as well. Tom Anderson says that Trump has done nothing but consistently let me down since he's elected. At this point, I can't. There's no point in arguing with black pillars. Because we're not going to change their mind. So what's happening in Canada? We're up to almost 74,000 cases, just short of 5,500 deaths. Manitoba still leads Saskatchewan 7-6 in terms of deaths. Both of these provinces have over 1 million people. How this How COVID-19 could be considered even a crisis in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, let alone a catastrophe, is absolutely beyond me. Well, everyone else was doing it, right? Trump on COVID-19. This is from CTV News. Vaccine or no vaccine, we're back. BC government reveals plan to reopen schools. They can return to class part-time on June the 1st. If this social distancing continues, none of this makes any sense. None of it makes any sense. I was thinking about churches. If they require social distancing, the 2-meter rule, then essentially we're looking at the churches being 1/3 or 1/4 full. So are they going to lay on, more services, more masses? I rather doubt it. Doubt it. So what is the message being sent? Well, that attending church on Sunday, attending mass, it's optional now. Then that will mean that a great many people will simply stop attending entirely, and they say, "Oh, that I'm going to do this virtually," and they won't do it. It's that simple. Canadians enter uncharted May long weekend with varying COVID-19 restrictions. Oh dear. I mean, there's not uniformity. It's Victoria Day over the weekend in honor of Queen Victoria, who was Queen and Empress when Canada became a Dominion in 1867. Feds to subsidize wages through the summer, Prime Minister says. Yes. He says the 75% federal wage subsidy program is being expanded by 3 months to the end of August to assist employers as they look to reopen their businesses. The federal government is also expanding the eligibility for the financial aid program and is committing $450 million towards temporary wage assistance for medical researchers whose work is unrelated to COVID-19 but have been impacted by the pandemic. Canada was in very serious economic trouble even before COVID-19, and how long before it's bankrupt? What? The end of the year, perhaps? And what happens then? Angus Reid, the polling company. Remember when we went to the movies, or when summer vacation plans included getting on planes? What day is it today, anyway, for Canadians greeting each sunrise to begin a day eerily similar to the last? The cycle of self-isolating, staying home, and not doing too much may be beginning to grate. Nonetheless, the latest public opinion data from the nonprofit Angus Reid Institute finds Canadians resigned to their fate for the long haul. 7 in 10, or 68%, now see a timeline for a full return to normal life post-COVID-19 as at least 6 months away. There won't be a Canada if this keeps up for another 6 months. This represents a stark increase in the number of Canadians holding this view from March, where it was 30%, and April, 43%. For the vast majority, 79%, their primary concern continues to be the risk of illness for friends and family, compared to 59% who say they are worried about their personal risk. The good news is that for many, the potential economic turmoil foreseen in the early days of the pandemic has not been realized. Are they kidding us? Are they kidding us? What are we looking at here in Canada? 25, 30% unemployment, with the government paying 75%? This is a disaster. It is absolute a disaster. Someone called Tony Keene in a very irksome opinion piece on CBC News today. He is described as previously being a reservist in the Canadian Armed Forces for 40 years and completing multiple overseas tours of duty. He has worked as a journalist in newspapers and broadcasting. He wants all guns banned. The Canadian government moved to ban a whole bunch of long guns, rifles, so-called military style, Orwellian words. Why Canada should ban the sale and ownership of handguns? There is no conceivable reason why an ordinary person needs a handgun, writes Tony Keene. Only military style assault rifles. It's just uh, it doesn't mean anything. As I pointed out at the time, soldiers carry sidearms. They carry pistols as well. But perhaps that led him to suggest this idea. Those of us trained in the use of handguns, and I mean properly trained by the police or the military, not just a weekend course at the local gun club, know that the armed amateur is dangerous. A police officer on a gun call does not want Citizen Rambo whipping out a personal gat to come to their assistance. That officer needs a clear field of observation and fire, and only one potential threat. Some years ago, my former boss, Doug Christie, investigated the killing of a man in Nanaimo by the RCMP. And so this man came out of his apartment building and he was holding something. He was told to stop, and a bunch of officers started blasting away at him. And Doug Christie found shells all over the place, bullet holes in every possible direction. I've seen enough YouTube videos to know that there are a lot of people who take guns very seriously and take every opportunity to practice with guns, of both pistols and rifles, and they are very good shots. I have no reason to believe that police officers are particularly good shots. Uh, People who rave about owning these devices of death are often referred to as gun enthusiasts. This makes about as much sense as poison gas enthusiasts or landmine enthusiasts. Collecting and slavering over devices which are primarily designed to kill people is not normal. Okay, here's the thing. It has been proved in court again and again that police forces have no obligation to protect anyone. They don't. They have been taken to court many times, and the courts have consistently ruled that no, the police have no such obligation. What if what if children and their teachers are being butchered inside a school? Well, we learned what the procedure is from Columbine High, and it's called Secure the Perimeter. That the police, despite the fact that students at Columbine had handmade signs saying, "Please help, our teacher is bleeding to death." Nope. They just wait until everyone who is going to die has died. And then they enter the building. That obviously, on this earth, one's best defender is oneself. And each individual has the primary responsibility in this regard, because you cannot depend on others to protect you. But I see that COVID-19 has emboldened a great many people. That we can just tell Canadians that they don't have any rights anymore, and that they should just be fearful of everything and everybody and absolutely helpless. This banning of guns leads to a situation such as in Britain, where actually, as Oberyn pointed out some decades ago, if you bring as much as a hat pin and you put it in your pocket to defend yourself against a mugger, and the police find out, they will arrest you. The police have absolutely no interest in home burglaries. They don't. And God help you if you defend yourself from people attempting to burgle your residence. You are far more likely to be jailed than the burglars. Anyone if you read the newspapers on the internet, you know that there are organized gangs of thieves in every city. Police know about this. Do they ever bust any of these rings? Do people ever get their belongings back? I remember I was burglarized some years ago to the tune of what would be in, I suppose, modern dollars, about $15,000 or $20,000. I called the police. An officer arrived. He was very polite. And I asked him, "Am I ever going to get any of my stuff back? Is there a possibility?" And he gave me that look that says, "You are a baby. Why would you even ask such a question?" And of course, I thought, why did I even call the police? If it happens again, I'm simply not going to bother. And let's move on to the book club. And our book today is by Ralph Townsend, and it is called Ways That Are Dark, The Truth About China, and it's from 1933. And it was originally published by Putnam, which was a highly respected publisher. Now, I'm going to have some caveats here right from the very beginning. I'm going to have to denounce this book as a wicked and vicious for obvious reasons, but I think it's with the anti-Asian feeling rising everywhere in the West. It's good to know and to debunk some of these theories. I should also mention that Ralph Townsend, he was an anti-interventionist in the late 1930s and early 1940s, and he was prosecuted and jailed he was arrested for acting as a Japanese agent without registering under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And then he was charged in what is called the Great Sedition trial. Let's see, 33 defendants. This whole thing fell apart, and essentially the position of the Roosevelt government is that people who campaigned against the United States entering the Second World War were traitors. That was their position. This had a very unfortunate effect on Ralph Townsend. It made him into a conspiracy theorist, and he later became affiliated with a nasty man called Willis Carto. I have seen this happen, in real life, that people who are marginalized for certain opinions which were fully acceptable until recently, say, they tend to seek the company and the comfort of other marginalized people. And as often or not, they lose their moorings. But I should note that Townsend wrote this book years before he got involved in the anti-intervention movement, and decades before he got entangled with people such as Willis Carto. So I think that the book has to be measured in its by its own merits. I mean, the book speaks for itself. It was a bestseller in the United States. And apparently, in recent years, it has been republished in Japan, and it became a bestseller there. One of the interesting claims Townsend makes in his book that the lack of freedom that obviously that the communist Chinese live under now, it's not a new thing. For instance, the KMT, the Kuomintang, or so-called nationalist government, which was eventually defeated by Mao Zedong, with the remnant fleeing to Taiwan, that they were instructing that all schools, they made it a law that all schools must teach KMT propaganda, and that there was no freedom of religion in China as well, even under the KMT government. Now, the Chinese are obviously much better off than they were during the periods of great turmoil, warlordism and a communist insurrection in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and of course invasion by Japan. But the question is, is the character of the Chinese, has it changed? And what we have seen in recent years in China is the imposition of a social credit system, and in fact, surveillance of a type, of an intensity really unknown in human history. And it's tempting, reading this book, to come to the conclusion that the Chinese have not changed. Now, Townsend wrote this book as a warning. The warning was, I suppose, directed towards those who worked as what the Chinese call missionaries. That is what they called missionaries. This is not just referring to religious people, but other people doing business or a charitable work in China. It is of more concern now, of course, because there are a great many Chinese people, both immigrants and from immigrant cohorts who live in our Western countries now. And there have been claims made that the government of China has great influence on our Western nations. That Townsend, his conclusions were drawn from the time that he spent as an American consular official in China, in Shanghai and in Fuzhou. And I suppose he was there for about a year and a half. He traveled extensively in the country, but as he points out in the book, at that time, much of China was effectively sealed to the West because it was difficult to impossible to get to many places in the heart of China, and that trips that would take, I don't know, half a day or a day in the West would often take weeks in China. He begins the book. This book on China and the Chinese will contain no apologies. It will present no strenuous effort where uncomplimentary revelations are made to drag in some supposedly extenuating or counterbalancing virtue possessed by the people whose actions and attitudes are under review in the pages to follow. We have had enough of all that. Too many otherwise worthwhile books dealing with China have muddled their information and left their readers confused by fatuous attempts to sprinkle bright hopes over dark facts. And there has been of late a superabundance of maudlin sentiment about China in comparison with the scarcity of clear-cut information. This book is intended to supply information. If reading it requires at times a strong stomach, this book is at least an honest attempt to present the facts as they are, however unpleasant. An accurate survey of what is going on in China necessarily includes much that is hideous and terrible, for the simple reason that a great deal of what the Chinese are doing is hideous and terrible. I'm going to break in here to say that the last part of this book, Ways That Are Dark, is kind of an encomium to the Japanese and of the Japanese invasion, which began in 1931, which Townsend thoroughly supported. And he thought that Japan had a noble civilizing mission in China. And Townsend was clearly unbalanced on the Japanese question, because we know in their treatment of not just the Chinese, but of members, prisoners of war, British and American soldiers, and even civilians, that the Japanese proved themselves to be every bit as savage as the Chinese in that regard. One reads well-attested cases, the conquest of Singapore, with nuns being knocked down and raped in the street by Japanese soldiers, by people having their eyes gouged out with spoons, etc., etc. Now, it's clear that Townsend is not a religious man, that he doesn't have much sympathy for Christianity, but he makes some interesting points about China in this regard. That is to say, there is nothing in China that accords to what Westerners regard as religion. There simply isn't. What you have instead is idol worship or superstition. Now, he argues that there's really no need for Christianity in China. He further argues that it is not made very many strides there because of the attitudes of the Japanese people. There were about 400 million people in China at the time that he wrote the book, and about 2 million of them were Roman Catholics, and about 750,000 were Protestants. But he argues that, if the Chinese actually followed what Confucius had written, well, they wouldn't need religion. Now, ethical systems are 10 a penny. There's simply an enormous difference between revealed religion, and revealed religions would be Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and so-called natural religions, because it is central to revealed religions that the adherents are instructed that they must do this and not do that, not simply because this is a good or bad thing, but because God wills it. And in the absence of such force, such terror behind commandments, there's little evidence that anyone is going to follow them. In brief, Townsend's argument is that China has been the same for thousands and thousands of years. It is a stultified, bureaucratic country which has elaborate codes going back thousands of years, and that wish fulfillment is exceedingly important. And wish fulfillment is essentially what goes on there. And one wonders whether that is true to this day, because, of course, the Chinese, and we have ample evidence of this, have built cities with all the accoutrements for a population of 1 million, and yet they are empty. There's no reason for us to trust any figures that come from China about COVID-19 or anything else. It is a mystery and will remain so. You may have heard of a few years ago about this incident which shocked many people in the West, that a woman driver, she accidentally ran over a person, and then she proceeded to back over this person and then forward again. And apparently this was tied to Confucian ideas about harmony in the universe. That if the person were to be crippled, well then, he could be crippled for decades. If a payment were made to the family for a dead man rather than a crippled one, this would restore harmony. Townsend argues in his books that the Chinese have a superstitious horror of maimed or crippled people, that they are considered to be exceedingly inauspicious. And the Chinese believe very much, there's no question of this, in good auspices. That's the reason why that their companies, typically have names like, Happy Golden Jade, whatever. Because the belief is that if auspicious names are given to a company, then the company will be successful. The Chinese, yes, he writes here, in much of China, perhaps all of it, I'm not personally sure, Chinese traveling in small passenger boats up and down the rivers commonly travel two together. The reason is that if one becomes ill while traveling alone, the captain or boat owner of the Chinese raft will at once toss him off and abandon him on the superstition that if he should die on board, the event might bring bad luck to the boat. Hence, a passenger will take a relative or a trusted friend, or a friend he hopes he could trust, by way of a safeguard to intervene and perhaps save his life should sudden illness develop. Apologists for the Chinese point out that in such a case, the boat captain is merely following the rigid superstitions he has inherited and for which he is not in his ignorance responsible. But there seems more to the matter than that. I have never seen, and I have not encountered anyone else who has seen, a Chinese stricken with grief in the act of fulfilling his obligations of superstition against the evident dictates of human feeling. What we see among them is complete indifference to supreme distress in anyone of their immediate family or associations, even where the most trifling effort would assist the afflicted person. Anywhere and almost any time in China, you can see a cart fallen on a man or a horse or some similar accident plentiful in the crowded streets, with curious onlookers not stirring a hand to lift the injured out of his predicament. This indifference to fellow suffering seems by all evidence to be distinctly Oriental. The anecdote of the Good Samaritan in the Bible suggests that an unwillingness to aid a suffering stranger was the established etiquette around Palestine at that time, since the Good Samaritan who lent a hand and did nothing more than almost any passing motorist would do in similar circumstances among us today, was looked upon as a highly exceptional chap. At corresponding stages of civilization and culture, most Occidental races appear to have exhibited vastly greater advances in the cultivation of fellow feeling than most Oriental races. The earliest records that survive of the Greeks, the Romans, Britons, and other Europeans indicate that ready assistance to a fellow creature was general where no enmity prevailed. And we may gather from accounts of American Indian fighting that those forest savages would at times make strenuous efforts to rescue a wounded brave on a field of conflict. Now, a vast overgeneralization, surely, but there are many, many videos on YouTube, which you may have seen, where a person, a woman, is walking in an enclosed mall, and the ground literally opens up beneath her, and she is swallowed into the darkness, and the other shoppers pay no attention whatsoever. And this is shocking to us. But Townsend argues that it has always been that way. One of the problems, well, I'll tell you that there is I know this to be true because I've seen it written up myself, that it was said of the Chinese back at around the time that Townsend was in China, that if an agreement, can do means it would be done. No can do means that it could not be done. Townsend says that this is simply not true, and that as far as the subjects, that it is all about saving face. This is the important thing. That if it is pointed out that a contract has not been honored, then the claim will be made that it has been honored. If it is pointed out that it can be proved that it has not been honored, then the claim will be made that this is the first time that this has been brought to my attention. When it is pointed out with evidence that this is not the first time it has been brought to his attention, there will be a flurry of words, or perhaps abuse. Are you accusing me of being dishonest? And Townsend makes the gross generalization about the Chinese that words are essentially meaningless to them. That they say what they want to say for their own reasons. He notes that the Chinese are exceedingly hardworking, that they had, at least at that time, an enormous capacity for work, which would have been, exhausting for Westerners, that they were typically not given to complaints about the, physical tolls, but that he said that it was curious that with all of this furious work, that little seemed to ever get done. This lack of empathy that Townsend points out in this book is very troubling indeed. And he claims to have seen plays or reviews or whatever in which the death of others is considered to be absolutely hilarious. And he does not think that this is going to change in any way whatsoever. And if one looks at the madness of the Cultural Revolution between or the Great Leap Forward before that what kind of regime would believe that peasants could, smelt pig iron in their homes, in their hovels, and that this would be a wise thing to do, for instance. The Chinese communists have their, 5-year plans and the like, just as the Soviet communists did. But, the question is, are these directives met? And to what extent are they done properly? And the book is very troubling to read. As I say, one must keep in mind that Townsend seemed to have a genuine aversion to the Chinese. He believed that they were America's most serious problem in Asia, and he had kind of a hero worship of the Japanese. But the argument that he makes throughout the book, that people are always making excuses for the Chinese, it seems to be genuinely true, without question. That I recall, even during the Cultural Revolution, that it was common for, I don't know, liberals, left-wing people to make pilgrimages to China. And in the midst of this almost unfathomable horror, they would come back, and I've heard these tales myself, about what an ideal society China was, and how they were making great strides there, and that China was a model for our own countries. I don't recall any of these people issuing grumbling apologies when the truth about that madness was brought to light. But I recently read some excerpts from an Atlantic article by 2 law professors talking about how China is a model for us, and specifically the social credit policies of China and its rather savage censorship. And the argument was made that free speech is too dangerous, especially in the COVID-19 age, that free speech kills people, and the Chinese have given us a shining path to follow, which is absolutely shocking, but there we are. I note that the sinologist Owen Lattimore hated this book. He said it was a general indictment of a whole race and would only convince people who are convinced already. I'll point out that Owen Lattimore was a communist, but I suppose that's irrelevant, This book is out of copyright. It is easily available, and it is certainly thought-provoking. But of course, I must thoroughly condemn, in the strongest possible terms, how would you say, the libel, the defamation of a whole people. That certainly should not be permitted. But again, this is a interesting and thought-provoking book. But as I say, about the everything after his description of the so-called Shanghai incident in 1931, it's completely irrelevant, and there's no need to read that section of the book, which 336 pages when it was published, so that saves you about 100 pages. So that is the book club for the week. And what do we have upcoming next week? Just let me check. On Theater Thursday, I'm going to be talking about a movie which came out yesterday called Horse Girl, which stars Alison Brie, particular favorite of mine. And on Other Book Club, a very different kind of book next week, a British book, a 100-year-old, more classic, called The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, which is about the joys of the country and messing about in boats. So let's take a final look at the chat. Okay. Claire Koss says there are loads of Westerners in China who go there just to get a job and are paid very well. Oliver Eterna says, imagine not being able to leave the country or state because you didn't have enough social credit points. Well, um, Justin Trudeau said a couple of years ago that he admired China's basic dictatorship, pointing out that it's much easier for governments to get things done, much easier in China than in, say, Canada. I suppose one of the reasons it's much easier is that because if people disagree with your decisions, you can throw them in prison or execute them. The obesity epidemic, for instance, could be tackled using a social credit system. Says Tom Anderson, what makes anyone believe that it would stop with obesity? Dawn from Beyond says, Kevin, I've been watching Community, very funny indeed, and delighted to see that one of my daughters-in-law bears an uncanny resemblance to Alison Brie. One thing I didn't say when I was talking about Community, which should have, is that it's clearly a multicultural fantasy, but I'm not going to hate it for that, and for the reason that I expressed earlier, that the minority characters in this show are far more interesting than the typical minority characters you get on TV show, because they are not saints, and they are not constantly lecturing people on morality, and they're not constantly giving, you know, white liberals permission to exist. Edward Richardson says, you know, leftists will completely excuse away communist atrocities. That's been the history, and of course, in our present day, well, communism collapsed in 1991 in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union officially was disbanded, and then the boys from Harvard came in, and the country got sold off to the oligarchs. Vladimir Putin put a stop to that, to further thievery, and he brought the oligarchs to heel. That appears to be the reason why he is so hated by our Western elite. There are abuses of power in the Soviet Union, no question about it, and media freedom is not as high as it is in Western countries. On the other hand, there's no media freedom in China, and China takes dissidents, imprisons them, or disappears them, and few of our elites seem to be bothered by that. One comes to the conclusion that, rather like Justin Trudeau, they admire this, because if these people ever attained total power, our lives would truly be turned upside down. But of course, they have been already. What were the failures of the Kuomintang? Townsend says that the Chinese are not known for their loyalty, and this was a problem that the Kuomintang had, that leaders would typically, they just say, oh, well, I'm just going to become a warlord here. Okay, I can control this area of territory and loot it to make myself rich. So, you know, I don't need to depend on my army salary anymore, for instance. That the Kuomintang was curiously, perversely protected by Joseph Stalin. And you know, they were invaded by Japan, and one of the reasons that the KMT had great difficulty in pushing back the Japanese was because, of course, they were facing a communist insurgency at the same time. I think all of Chinese presidents have a school of thought attributed to them, e.g. Mao Zedong thought, Xi Jinping thought, Claire Ka thought. Whatever happened to Angry Chinaman? I don't know. I quite enjoyed his contributions to Luke Ford's show. Edward Richardson says Pol Pot's real name was not Pol Pot. It is Solath Sar. Pol Pot comes from political potential because that was his nickname as per Red Chinese. This guy has political potential. You know, they were radicalized, Khmer Rouge in Paris. That they picked up a bunch of half-understood Marxist notions and went back to their native country and killed 2 million people, just engaged in it. Everyone must leave the cities. This is year zero. Yes, one wonders how, you know, doctrines like communism are, to what extent they're actually even understood in, say, China. Okay. So, Oliver Eternus says Xi Jinping cares about genetic Han folk. I think it's very, very funny that Winnie the Pooh is banned in China because people say there's a resemblance between the president and the cartoon, a character. I just the degree of sensitivity that one must have in order to ban a children's comic book character because of the fear that it will be used to mock the dear leader. Too funny. Anyway, that's the show for today, and that's the show for this week. I want to thank you all very much for watching, listening in. I'll be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show, I would, or any part of it, I would be greatly pleased if you click on the like button and or subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not already. If you would like to support the show, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And I will leave you for this week with what is now my traditional benediction and farewell, that in these times of total social isolation, of atomization, I do dearly hope that all of you manage to find some genuine human connection. Good night.